Well, welcome to episode 419 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this time it's a special episode. It's Jazz Under the Radar number 6. Now this series is of course dedicated to superb jazz recordings, which generally speaking will be unknown to most viewers of this channel. In some cases they're also kind of hard to find, but all of them are worth seeking out. Once again, these aren't necessarily budget titles. Some of them will be. In other cases, the laws of supply and demand apply. Thus, you can, I guess, consider these records to be records that are off the beaten track, albums by artists that are lesser known, or maybe labels that are kind of hard to find, or about which maybe there's not that much written. Now, this is an exciting time here at Record Review Towers, because not only is this video chock full of exciting records to talk about, the next video I make is going to mark the 5th anniversary of this channel, which went live to not much fanfare and fairly tepid feedback on May the 1st, 2020. And to mark this milestone, in that video, I'm going to do an Ask Me Anything segment. Now, I'm going to put out a special video soliciting questions for that segment, but if there's a question that you already have which is burning a hole in your frontal lobe, by all means put it in the comments below and I'll find a way to include it. And if you'd like total anonymity, send me an email via the contact information provided in the channel description. Anyway, that's going to be a lot of fun. This is going to be a lot of fun, so right now let's dive into those 10 records that fly under the radar. Now, the first record I want to talk about is this one by Phil Woods and Gene Quill, called Phil and Quill. It comes out on RCA in 1957. Now, for a guy who made about 80 records as a leader, Phil Woods doesn't really get a lot of press these days, and his recording career is actually kind of unusual. He had a flying start making records as a leader for Prestige in the mid to late 1950s. He then steps back for almost a decade to the end of the 1960s, basically acting as a sideman, and he then re-enters the jazz world as a leader, but at a point where the sun has largely set on jazz as, the main event in American popular music. So his later work, which is excellent, probably never got the attention that it deserved, but this is from his earlier period, his more high-profile period, when he and Gene Quill had formed a partnership which lasted, I think, about 6 records over about 3 or 4 years. As for Gene Quill, his career kind of parallels Woods', only in a more kind of abbreviated way. He had some great creative years in the 1950s. He spent the 60s as a kind of supporting player in the bigger bands of Jerry Mulligan and then Buddy Rich, and his music career, I would say in general, was stunted, not so much due to lack of talent as maybe due to what you might call refueling issues. Anyway, this record, Phil and Quill, as I mentioned, came out on RCA in 1957, not to be confused with a record called Phil and Quill with Prestige, which also comes out in 1957, but on Prestige, I guess, obviously. But if you did confuse them, they'd be forgiven. And what you get on these records, and these guys are both great alto players, is a couple of musicians and a supporting cast who have really worked out a pretty successful formula and are serving it up. So it's not going to turn your world upside down, but it's really very good, straight ahead jazz, very enjoyable music. And I would suggest that this is a record made by musicians with a great understanding. It's a fun record, so pick it up. Now, the next record I'm going to talk about is this one, which came out on Riverside in 1960. This is an original mono on Riverside from 1960. It is by the Dick Morgan Trio, called See What I Mean. Now, the more I listen to music and I read about music and I talk about music, and the more musicians that I meet and talk to, the more convinced I am of the centrality of the role of chance and personality in determining whether or not somebody has a great musical career or a truly outstanding one. And Dick Morgan is a case in point. He hailed from Washington, D.C., and he was flat out one of the finest, most wonderful, most soulful jazz piano players that ever walked the earth. I would put him comfortably in a category along with Junior Mance or Ray Bryant in offering up beautiful, bluesy piano jazz trio music. But unlike Mance and Bryant, he did not make many records as a leader. There are a few later recordings which I guess are kind of lesser in importance, but his main opus is limited to 3 records he made with Riverside in 1960 and 1961. And those records followed his discovery by Cannonball Adderley, who at that point was working as a kind of unofficial, well, he wasn't getting paid. He thought he was getting paid, but he wasn't, talent scout for Orrin Keep News and Riverside. The records he makes for Riverside include a live recording at the Showboat Jazz Club in Washington, D.C., and this record, both of which feature a trio which has Bertel Knox on drums and Keter Betts on bass. And a side note on Keter Betts, he then moves to play with Charlie Byrd, which is how he ends up playing on Jazz Samba with Stan Getz, the record which breaks open bossa nova internationally. Now back to Morgan, he makes one more record for Riverside in 1961, Settlin' In. That has a new trio featuring Ben Riley on drums and Joe Benjamin on bass. Now Morgan might have had a more extensive discography, might have been a more high-profile player, might not have been featured on Jazz Under the Radar for that matter, if he had made the decision to leave Washington and go to either New York or perhaps secondarily to LA, which is where most musicians with serious careers ended up. I say serious, I guess I mean higher profile, because what Morgan elects to do is stay in Washington, and he basically lives out life as the dean of jazz piano in the nation's capital. As I mentioned, this is a soulful jazz piano trio. It's not going to rattle your cage, but it's going to go down easy. I've already mentioned Junior Mance and Ray Bryant. Kind of remiss, I guess, not also referencing the OG soul jazz trio, the Three Sounds. If you like the Three Sounds, you're going to like Dick Morgan. Simple as. Now, the third record that I'm going to talk about in this video is this record, which came out on Bethlehem in 1956. This is an original 1956 pressing. It's by Russ Garcia. It's called Four Horns and a Lush Life. The cover is by Bert Goldblatt, who is usually lionized for the quality of his covers, and there is a certain appeal to this cover. Fortunately, you can't read a damn thing that's written on it. It's got about 1,000 or 2,000 nude figures writhing in agony, I guess, in eternal torment. With four horns, or four trombones, I guess, because there are four trombones on this record. It doesn't actually mention the name of the artist on here, which is probably just as well, because if it were written here, you wouldn't be able to read it, because the text that is there is basically illegible. So all I'm saying is Bert Goldblatt did better work. Anyway, so much for the outside. The inside is pretty good. Russ Garcia is one of those guys like Marty Paich and Jack Montrose and others who kind of lived in that netherworld between working for the movie studios and arranging and conducting and orchestrating and writing music for movies and TV, but also maintaining a legit jazz presence in the recording studio and in the clubs in LA just as life went on. On this record, Garcia functions as arranger and conductor. I don't believe he's playing. And as is typical of LA recordings around this time, the sidemen that he compiles are pretty stellar. I mean, these were some of the very best players from the big bands who washed up in LA, and they're all getting session work, and they're all playing extremely well when they do get into the studio. This is because it was a Bethlehem recording on the West Coast, in all likelihood a Red Clyde production, but there's no producer credit on here. For the most part, it consists of standards like Lush Life, but it does include at least one memorable original composition, which is Russ Garcia's I'll Never Forget What's Her Name, which I think is a fabulous title. The shtick on this album is four trombones, and I'm on the record as saying the trombone, I think, is an undervalued instrument and an underappreciated instrument in jazz. And this would be one of the records that I would introduce into evidence to support my case. The combination of those four trombones working together, the arranging talents of Garcia, the sheer amount of talent on this record, which includes people like Frank Rosolino, Herbie Harper, Maynard Ferguson on trombone, actually not on trumpet, Stan Levy on drums, Red Mitchell on bass, Marty Paich on piano, and so on. In fact, 6, I think, of the 8 musicians on here are all well-established leaders and had well-established careers in the recording studio, putting out their own records, in addition to being on this record. All of that means that this is a truly great session. The head arrangements may come across as a little traditional, but the soloing is top-notch and very contemporary for 1956. It's a great example of the kinds of records that Bethlehem was getting so right around that time. So do look for this one. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a bit later. It actually comes from 1970, I believe, and it comes out on Atlantic. It's by Clarence Wheeler and the Enforcers, looking very enforcing on the front, doing what we wanna, and really, who am I to say they can't? Now, a little digression here. When I was in my late 20s, just a few years ago, and I was looking to break out of my rock and roll prison and listen to other kinds of music, I explored all kinds of other avenues. And one thing that I knew I liked, but again, this is before the internet functioned. Wouldn't say it functions well now, but at least it functions better than it did. And it was kind of hard to research these things. I mean, you could look up old magazines and so on, but basically you had to do an awful lot of listening in booths and so on. And I knew I was really interested in what I sensed was gritty, funky, soul-influenced music, a bit jazzy, but with a great beat that came from the early 1970s, typically played and written by black musicians. This much I knew. I knew a few records, but you know, growing up where I grew up, I didn't have that much exposure. So I spent a lot of time listening to CD compilations as they were at the time. And there was an awful lot of stuff. This is, you know, kind of the acid jazz period where you were getting, you know, rare groove and deep groove and urban grooves and acid jazz and whatever, all these kinds of compilations. And I went through a phase of buying a whole bunch of these CDs, a lot of compilations, and I was routinely disappointed because I found that the music on these compilations was rarely as good as the cover art or the whole general vibe that was being portrayed in the packaging. A case in point, I would say, is the soundtrack to Shaft. Okay, the title track's all right, the pusher is okay, but neither of those tunes is particularly funky or, in my very parochial experience, groovy. Anyway, I've come a long way, I think, since that point, and these days I'm kind of a connoisseur of that particular era, and I know a lot more about what I like and what I don't like and what I've been able to find. And I would have to say that here for me is a record which is near the top of the heap in delivering on the promise of what so much of that CD compilation cover art actually threatened to deliver. It's funky, it's jazzy, it's gritty, instrumental soul. And it's not surprising, I would say, that this comes out on Atlantic, because Atlantic absolutely had their ear to the ground all the way through the 1960s when it came to soul music. Now, I say soul music, I'd say this record really exists at the intersection, the three-way intersection between jazz, soul, and funk. And it is absolutely full of bangers from start to finish. And in particular, I would single out the first track on side 2, which is evocatively called Right On. And if you've ever thought to yourself, okay, I want a song called Right On to sound like a song called Right On should sound, well, let me tell you, this song, Right On, sounds exactly like a song called Right On should sound. They also have a cover of a song by a little-known pop combo from Liverpool called Hey Jude. Now, normally, the Beatles being my first love, I would run screaming from anybody who does a Hey Jude cover. And in fact, I have a hard time even listening to the original because it's so overplayed. But I have to say, this version is fantastic. And I also have to endorse this record for anybody who likes the Hammond B3. This is a record for you. Anyway, don't take my bald-headed word for this. Go out and get yourselves a copy of this one. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a bit of a change of pace. It is the Roger Kellaway Trio, self-titled, on Prestige from 1965. Roger Kellaway comes from a generation of jazz artists I always kind of find interesting because they're born after the big wave of jazz giants like Coltrane and Davis, who were all born in the mid-1920s. Kellaway is born in the late 30s. He's a contemporary of people like Chick Corea and Charles Lloyd and Freddie Hubbard. And these are people who grow up in the music. They're not there necessarily breaking down walls or ripping up scripts. What they have to do in their career is find a place within a canon to which they're also contributing. So it's a little bit, for you philosophy of science nerds out there, like they're doing normal science, not revolutionary science. Kellaway, by the way, is still very much a going concern. I think I mentioned in a previous video some time ago that I actually have one of his old records, which he had in his collection at one point. He put his stamp on it. It says Roger Kellaway on the front, and then I guess sold it or gave it away, and then I emailed him, and he was kind enough to email me back. He's a real gent. Anyway, we had a nice chat. Who knows? Maybe I'll get to interview him at some point if I get organized enough. Anyway, his career has taken many twists and turns, but talent has never been an issue. He has enormous amounts of talent, both as a virtuoso performer and as a composer, and if anything, his career is I guess, characterized by following all kinds of avenues that were available to him, not just composing and playing jazz, but also doing work in movies and TV and lots of other stuff which was more commercial, which might have set his career back in some people's eyes. Anyway, he eventually finds his way around to doing all manner of different things and has composed an enormous amount of jazz music. This is early in his career. It's when, I've never talked to him about this, obviously, or read about this, but I'm inferring that this is a period of time when he's still setting himself up as, you know, a sort of pure jazz musician before he takes some of his more commercial detours. And it is a fascinating record. If I can say this, and I say this not as a criticism, but as an observation, I think this is a guy who's got such a big brain that he's pulled in a zillion directions. And later in his career, my sense is, from what I have heard of his later stuff, that he gets more focused. He's not unfocused here, he's just tempted by all kinds of different avenues, and he has the ability to go on all these different kinds of tangents. So if you like innovation, if you like exploration, if you don't necessarily want the same song track after track after track, well, this record is for you because there's lots of innovation and lots of intrigue and lots of excitement, frankly. I mean, my primary thing I found myself saying when I listened to this record is, wow, or how about that, or what the heck did he do there? So again, if you're titillated by innovation, I encourage you to pick this one up. Now, this next record I want to talk about is one of those records that sometimes happens in this series that may actually not fit the criteria I'm applying of being under the radar, because the performer is actually very well known. But I think this one still is kind of under the radar, so I'm going to go with it. The musician is Curtis Fuller. This is Sliding Easy. I've got a Japanese copy of this. This is one of Fuller's lesser known records, despite the fact that it has an absolutely kicking list of musicians on the disc. As I say, he's not exactly an unknown, but this is not one of the records that one normally hears discussed when his name comes up. It doesn't have a write-up in AllMusic. Its release history is after the first US release in 1959 is basically limited to Japanese reissues. In fact, I was talking about this record with a friend, and he said, you know, the Japanese jazz fans love Curtis Fuller to an inordinate degree, and I looked into that, and sure enough, they do. So anyway, good on you, Japan, once again, and thank you for this particular pressing. Now, the records that Curtis Fuller puts out that everybody talks about, those are the Blue Notes, the Savoys, and then later on his records for Impulse. Those are the ones which everybody tries to collect and which are going to command top dollar, and not so much this one. This is a record which comes out on the fairly unglamorous label United Artists. It comes out just in between the end of his time with Blue Note and the beginning of his time with Savoy. As I mentioned, it's never had an American reissue, which is kind of shocking when you look at the people who were on this record. And they include, I mean, basically it's an all-star team. Fuller, of course, is on trombone. Lee Morgan is on trumpet. Hank Mobley is on tenor sax. Tommy Flanagan is on piano. Paul Chambers is on bass. And no less a drummer than Elvin Jones is behind the kit. And if that weren't enough, you also have two other legends, Benny Golson and Gigi Grice, who are doing all of the arranging. Okay, you say, Allan, fine, that's all good. But is the music any good? It is freaking great. It is hard bop of, I would say, the highest order. It is not as frenetic, say, as the bop that the Jazz Messengers would play, or that, say, the Brown Roach Quintet would play. It's a little more like, I would say, the Jazztet. It's a little mellower than that. It's every bit as good as all those groups I mentioned, though, and it's hard to know why this one has largely been ignored, but I'm here encouraging you not to ignore it. Now, the next record that I have here is also a Japanese pressing, so it has a slightly different cover than the original, and it's also released on United Artists Records, and it is kind of a weird record. This record features two guys on piano, fine, a bit odd, but fine, but one of the guys is a name that a lot of people might put forward if asked to name the greatest jazz piano player in history, and the other is a guy who is not only better known, but almost exclusively known for playing valve trombone. In fact, this is the only record in Bob Brookmeyer's whole discography in which he only plays the piano and doesn't play the valve trombone. It's also a bit odd because it's got that, you know, two guys playing the same instrument and therefore not quite dueling, but playing off each other. But it's a mono record, so you have to concentrate pretty hard to know who is playing what, because you don't have piano 1 in the left channel and piano 2 in the right channel. All that said, it is actually not very hard to determine who is playing, because Bill Evans is a brilliant piano player and Bob Brookmeyer is a fine enough piano player to make a jazz record, but he's, you know, no Bill Evans. Brookmeyer is actually top billed here. At this point, Evans was not as famous as he was going to be. He was on the cusp of that fame, but he wasn't as famous as he would become, having been Miles Davis's sidekick on Kinda Blue and then making his wonderful Riverside albums in the early 1960s. Although, funnily enough, this record is actually made right in the middle of the 6-week period between the first session for Kinda Blue and the second session. So again, the question is, it's a bit of a strange concept, does it work? I think it does. I mean, Brookmeyer, although he's top billed, is basically the accompanist here. Evans also is not, you know, pulling a Hendrix and trying to showboat and do all kinds of crazy stuff. Well, he never was, you know, that crazy, but you know what I mean. He's exercising restraint, and I think there's a respectful interplay between the two musicians. It does work. It doesn't always click, but there are some passages here that I think are fantastic, and I found myself thinking, wow, it's kind of amazing that Brookmeyer pulls this off to the extent that he does. He knows his limitations and he plays within them, and Evans, in the nicest possible way of saying this, knows Brookmeyer's limitations and is respectful of those. Anyway, the rhythm section here, which I haven't mentioned so far, is top notch. It's the rhythm section from the Modern Jazz Quartet, which, given their kind of chambery bent, is kind of a good choice for this particular record, I would say. But, you know, it isn't really the rhythm section, in all fairness, that you're going to be paying attention to. It's the interplay between the two keyboardists, and at its best, this record contains some really interesting dynamics between these two players, between these two great jazz musicians, and even at its worst, it's a curiosity. Now, the next record that I'm going to talk about is by the George Redman Group. It came out in 1954 on Skylark Records, but this is one of those records which then subsequently gets reissued and rebranded because somebody who played on the original record is more famous than the original leader, George Redman, and that person is Bob Gordon. So I have a reissue not on Skylark Records but on Tampa Records under, you can see it there, Bob Gordon's name, the Bob Gordon Quintet, in full range hi-fi, which I guess is pretty exciting, although for the most part my experience of Tampa Records is it doesn't matter how full the range was in hi-fi, it was still going to be a pretty excruciating experience in terms of surface noise. But this record is not too bad, I will say. Tampa can really be hit and miss that way. This record actually has a really weird release history. It only has 3 releases in the United States on vinyl. All 3 of them have different titles. All 3 of them, I think, have different leaders. One of them is just a non-leader, and the other 2 are just 2 different people from the same quintet. And there's different cover art for all 3 as well. Anyway, as I say, my version's on Tampa. It's putatively led by Bob Gordon. Now, Bob Gordon was a very talented West Coast saxophonist who was tragically killed, I believe, in a car accident very early on in what was a very promising career. In fact, I'm almost certain that he dies in between the original release in 1954 and this release in 1956, and hence the rebrand, because his name was out there, and perhaps it was kind of a callous calculation that this guy was in the news, and therefore let's put this out under his name. As I mentioned, the original was a 10-inch record. Now, usually when a 10-inch record came out in the early 1950s and then it was reissued, or that material was reissued on a 12-inch record after 1955, normally you get a few extra tracks tacked on. Not so here. What you get is the same 6 songs that you had on the 10-inch record. So this is basically a 10-inch LP's worth of music, i.e. about 23 minutes on a 12-inch LP. So far, not such a ringing endorsement, I guess. Why am I including this? Well, it's actually really good music. This is really, I would say, high quality, low profile West Coast jazz, not least because of Gordon's contribution, but also because of the presence of the trombonist Herbie Harper, who goes on to have a terrific career in his own right as a leader for a number of West Coast labels. They weave together very well, and so as I say, if you like the kinds of stuff that comes out on Fantasy and Contemporary and Liberty or Capitol in the mid-1950s, then you're going to like this. This record is for you. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this record, which I picked up on my travels to New York about 2 or 3 months ago, prior to the travel boycott. I hasten to mention my fellow Canadians, and I talked about it in my video about the records I picked up on this trip, at least very briefly. I'd like to go into a bit more detail here. And what I want to talk about is Chris Anderson, the leader of this trio, and the incredible challenges that he had to overcome in order for his career to reach the heights that it did. Not only was he blind, but he also had brittle bone disease, which combined with blindness basically made it impossible for him to lead anything like a normal career as a touring jazz musician. He was highly susceptible to debilitating injuries, which took a long time to heal, and in an age which was far less, I guess, accommodating of people with disability than our own age, that limited his recording career in the prime of his musical life to a couple of records which came out in the early 1960s, of which this is one. This is probably the higher profile of the 2 releases. It comes out on the Riverside sub-imprint Jazzland. Now, in the 80s and 90s, Anderson does manage to pull together a more substantial recording career, but if you're really looking to capture the guy at his peak, it's hard to look past this record. He's often said to have influenced Herbie Hancock, and I hear some of that, I guess, but what I really hear when I listen to Chris Anderson is Thelonious Monk, either the influence of Monk or a similar disposition to that of Monk. He's not afraid of taking an angular line or a detour when he feels the urge. He's very clearly, from this record, a rare talent, and I find this record fascinating from beginning to end. And it's not often that I say about a record, oh, if you like Monk, you'll like this, because really there are so few people who are actually like Monk. This is an exception, and I think the only other piano player who ever kind of makes me feel that way is Herbie Nichols. Anyhow, for the sheer quality of the music, for the intrigue of his approach, and just for a triumph of this man's talent over disabilities and barriers which frankly would have stopped most people in their tracks, I recommend you get this, and maybe one day we'll remember that reducing barriers for people with disadvantages actually benefits everybody. Okay, off my soapbox, because the last record that I'm going to talk about is a record by another guy who had a tough time in life, frankly, Serge Chaloff. It is called Serge Chaloff Plays The Fable of Mabel. This too is a record with a somewhat strange release history, or at least it has a strange release history on Discogs. I think there's another story there which I'll relate to you. According to Discogs, the original release is on Vogue Records out of the UK in 1956, but there's lots of problems with that. First of all, Vogue Records didn't release original US jazz in the mid-1950s or maybe any time. It strictly existed as a reissue label for American labels. The second issue is that my Japanese copy from the mid-70s mentioned that the original LP was produced by George Wein, who owned Storyville Records, and it was Storyville LP 310. Now, Storyville LP 310 you can't find in Discogs, but if you're clever enough, I'm not calling myself clever, but I certainly am dogged, you can find that the sequence of Storyville releases that's on Discogs is missing LP 310, and clearly there would have been probably a 10-inch release in 1954 of this. So this recording, or set of recordings, because it's actually a compilation of 3 different sessions, probably comes from at least 1 and maybe 2 Storyville 10 inches from the, well, probably from 1954, I guess one could say specifically. So if you own an old-looking 10-inch version of this that has Serge Chaloff and Boots Masouli, who's the other saxophonist on here, that's a 10-inch and looks fairly venerable and is a Storyville release, then by all means do the world a favor and get on Discogs and record it, because we're missing the original pressing. Now, as I mentioned, this record features 2 whizzes on saxophonist, the baritone player Serge Chaloff and the alto player Boots Masouli. The supporting cast on here too are pretty strong. I'll mention just a couple of them. There's actually a whole bunch of people in here. It's an amalgam of 3 different sessions, so quite a few people. But Dick Twardzik is on here, and Russ Freeman is also on here, 2 wonderful piano players. Charlie Mariano is also here on alto sax, and Herb Pomeroy, who is a Boston mainstay on trumpet, is also on about half the tracks here. Anyway, all that said, this record is full of quirky, inventive playing from Chaloff, but also from his partners in crime, like Masouli, and I think also like Charlie Mariano. The sax play and the interplay here between the baritone and the 2 different altos is terrific. The compositions are not run-of-the-mill. They're really quite challenging, very interesting stuff from the mid-1950s. The title track itself, The Fable of Mabel, is well worth the price of admission all by itself. In other words, this is a listening record, not a background record, but it's certainly a record that's worth your time. Well, that concludes the 6th version of Jazz Under the Radar. I hope that you enjoyed these. I hope that most of them anyway were surprises even to you veteran jazz listeners and acquirers. A reminder too, if you've got questions for my Ask Me Anything, please put that question in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.